I'm very excited about this episode. I think it's going to be pretty unique. Before I tell you what today's video is going to be about, I want to take you on a quick journey. I want you to pretend you're 80 years old, you're on your deathbed, you've lived this finite amount of time, and as you are slipping away to the great beyond, instead of your life flashing before your eyes, you get a very hyper-specific statistical analysis of your life. Every word that you ever said accounted for, every action, a breakdown, how many of the things you said were beneficial, how many were harmful, what you did with your life, hour by hour, minute by minute, however you want to break it down. How much time did you spend hugging your kids versus playing golf? How much time did you spend at work or sleeping or eating or loving or hating, etc.? A holistic or high-level view of someone's life like this would be extremely sobering. How one chooses to utilize their time speaks volumes about that individual, what they care about, what they don't care about, what they're passionate about, their priorities. It is a great indicator of that person as an individual. But then there's God. God is not finite. God is infinite. So how could we tie God down? How could we know about God? He did one thing. He gave us this enclosed, finite book, one piece of media to convey himself and his will and his character and his passion one time to mankind. After trillions of years of just sitting around doing nothing, since God has no beginning, it was really infinite years, he one day decided to create a universe that was so big and so complex it should house tens of millions at the very least amount of planets that would support life. But he made this one particular one in this one particular galaxy that's pretty subpar comparatively speaking, created this one really weird species of mammal with a terrible tendency to sin, even though they were made in his nature. And a few thousand years into the existence of that mammal, he said, I'm going to give them this book. It took him 1600 years to finish this book. Even George R.R. Martin is starting to look like a saint comparatively. It was written in 3 different languages, which is already confusing enough, and by over 40 different ghostwriters. God is a big fan of ghostwriters. It would take another 300 or 400 years of arguing and fighting as we sorted out which books we were going to consider the Bible, which means that Christians throughout the history of Christianity have had very different concepts of their God and his purpose and what salvation is and the end times, etc. But this is not a video about the issues with the Bible or the history of canonization or all the problems with translations and interpretations or anything like that. Let's just assume for this video that the Bible is perfect. Let's just assume we got it right, and the 66 books we call inspired and infallible are exactly as God intended. This was his one shot at communicating perfectly in a physical form with his creation, so let's give it to him. This one finite thing we can actually judge him by, and let's give it that statistical analysis, objectively, like we might for anyone else's life. The Bible is how we can know God, so what does the Bible look like when we really begin to break it down? Before we get into the breakdown, I want to show you really quickly that we are starting with a very simple number, 800,000 words. God gave himself 800,000 words to explain his plan, his presence, and his purpose to the people that would follow him. And he said in his infinite knowledge and perfect understanding that this would suffice. This is the best he could do. This is his end goal. This wasn't his rough draft. This is God's perfect book. So now as we break down that perfect book, we're going to try to find some trends and try to understand God through those trends. And the first breakdown I want to do is Old Testament versus New Testament. The reason I want to do this is because Christian apologists and theologians and pastors and just the average day Christian themselves will tell you that the New Testament is what is important, that the Old Testament is Act 1 to set us up for the New Testament, that the Old Testament can really only be understood by Jesus Christ and what he fulfilled and did in the New Testament. But let's just look at God's intentions here. Here's a few stats on the Old versus the New Testament. 39 books in the Old Testament versus 27 in the New. 929 chapters in the Old Testament versus 260 in the New. 23,134 verses versus 7,957 verses. And 623,000 words in the Old Testament versus just 173,000 words in the New Testament. That's roughly 75% of the entire Bible is in the Old Testament. In fact, 20% of all words written in the Bible happen in the first 5 books of the Bible. If we were really giving this the attention that God gave it, we would have a lot more focus on the books of the Old Testament and what they say. But thanks to Paul and the 260 chapters that are in the New Testament, most of which are very short or very redundant. I mean, look at the Gospels. They're essentially telling the same story 4 times in a row. There's not actually that much information in the New Testament. But again, with Paul's help, we get a great scapegoat. We get a great reason to not care about the God of the Old Testament and what his character was truly showing us. Except, of course, if there's really pretty verses or verses that are obviously true or verses that we want to say point to the coming of Christ, then we'll use those verses from the Old Testament, but only if they fit the narrative, which is really insulting because you look at Judaism, they got an entire religion out of the Old Testament. And we just say, no, that's wrong or ineffective or unbalanced or just a part of the solution and really only setting up the problem. That's all bollocks, obviously, and I'd love to do videos on all of those topics. But what else can we learn as we break down this Bible in a more statistically speaking fashion? How about the importance that he places on man over woman or children? So who did God choose to write about? Who did he choose for his heroes in his stories? Who did he spend time talking about? This is an all-knowing, all-perfect God who gave his word and his son's life for everyone so that everyone could know him. So of course there's probably really good, solid, equal representation. Nope. Let's look at the stats. Man or men is mentioned 4,632 times in the Bible versus woman or women is mentioned only 788 times. But that's not fair because man can sometimes be used to indicate mankind, people as a whole. Let's get more specific. Let's do he, him, and she, her. So he, him, 23,160 times versus she, her, 3,347. Yikes. But what about children, babies, kids? That number is only 610. And by the way, most of the verses about babies, kids, or children, other than that one nice one where Jesus says, let the little children come to him, are about killing children, aborting children, and not like don't kill children, don't abort children, but like definitely do these things and let me tell you how. And also make sure you get it done or I'll punish you. Like when I tell you to go commit genocide on that people group, don't even leave their babies or smash their babies among the rocks and enjoy yourself. Literally verses like this. Some of the verses are not that intense. It's just kill your children if they don't obey, or children make sure you obey so you live a long life, stuff like that. Not a great look when you consider that God is supposed to be the good father and our example of how to parent. But wait a second, I think I can find more representation of where women and children come in. Let's look at another term that God likes to call these people: slaves and servants. That'll get us another 2,032 mentions. Now, of course, not all the slaves and servants were women and children, but many were. And if we really want to get their numbers up and try to create some similarities, we could add in the word whore or prostitute that was reserved only for the females among us, and that gets us another 241 mentions. Now, I know I'm being a little bit cheeky, but just a few verses on not harming children would have gone a long way. Just a few verses stating that women are equal to men would have saved an immense amount of suffering. The things that have gone unsaid in the Bible versus the things that have been said in the Bible blow my mind that someone who is all-loving, who is all-knowing, could allow this to be their stated case for humanity. Now, a lot of what we get back from that is, again, well, the Bible's not about social reform, which is ridiculous, that the Bible isn't there to teach us how to live. It's about the next life. Well, isn't the whole thing that we get objective morality from God and that we find that morality in his words? It goes on and on and on, excuses on both ends of the argument, and it's just enough. I'm absolutely disgusted and tired of it. Let's take God for what he says and what he doesn't say. In fact, and this brings us to our next section, God goes out of his way to talk about what's important, about how we should live our lives. Let's count them: 613 very hyper-specific laws, rules, and commandments listed from God, not from some prophet, not from some king, from the Creator himself. Here's your 613 laws. And we can argue all day about, well, those laws were Mosaic or Levitical laws, and they were here for a short time and to represent the culture, and God was working within these confines, and they were broken later. God is immutable. That means God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God says as much. Malachi 3:6 is very clear: for I, the Lord, do not change. Everyone acts like God was doing this thing and everything kind of got away. Then his son came around later, not like his son was there from the very beginning, which is definitely what the Bible says, and was like, hey, wait a second, let's turn the other cheek instead of eye for an eye, and sacrificed himself to himself, broke religion, etc. Jesus says he came to fulfill the law. Dot every I, cross every T on it. That he came to bring a sword, not peace. Jesus is the word, John 1:1 says. Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the word made flesh. They are the same. God's value and view of women and children and what he put his commandments and laws into for these 613 are what is important to God, are what God thinks about. And it would be ridiculous at best to hear about how long women should be gone from the group when they're menstruating and not to cross certain fabrics and don't eat this but do eat this, or here's how to erect your tent, etc. if there was also still a bunch of other good commands. But there's not. We get a few basic ones that every other tribe and group of people who have ever lived developed themselves because it's the only way societies work together. together. Then we got a bunch of harmful ones, all the while leaving out some of the most important ones. So 613 commandments is a lot to go through. They're broken down into 34 sections for the most part. And I want to be fair. There's some really good rules we might expect of an all-knowing, all-loving God. And then there's some that are just ridiculous. But I would ask you, as an individual, believer or atheist, you were going to create your own universe, your own people made in your kind, people you wanted to thrive in a society that was fair and just, whatever that meant to you. And let's say you got 10 rules or 20 rules or 50 rules. Do you think you could come up with something better than God? Because I do, easily. In fact, I've seen other societies come up with something better than the God of the Bible. Our modern judicial system is absolutely better than the laws of the Bible. Yeah, Brandon, but did you know that Western society's laws and morals are actually pretty much given to us by the Christian God? For sure. We absolutely had a huge influence from that. And then we took what was wrong and what was missing, like, I don't know, an abolition of slavery, and added it into our system. And we've continued to progress morally over time, which is what I would expect of a man-made society. It is not what I would expect of a perfect, all-knowing, all-loving God. So let's break some of these down. The first few, like the first 10, are all about how to treat God. And I'm going to be referencing over here because I don't want to get any of this wrong. So you need to know that God exists. You need to not blaspheme. You need to love God. You need to fear God, etc. We get 6 or 7 about the Torah. So to learn the Torah and teach it as a commandment, not to take anything away from the commandment of the Torah. We have 5 that are around signs and symbols, like circumcising the male offspring. And this is again where a lot of Christians will point at the New Testament. They'll be like, don't you see that through Christ we were grafted in? Paul talks a lot about this because it was a big deal to the early church and the new believers. What are we going to do about our penises? What was Jesus's penis like? What is God's penis like? That's the ideal of man, and he wants us to be circumcised, so he must be cut. But was Jesus cut? Of course he was. He was from a Jewish family. Where's his foreskin? Does it have magical properties? How does it taste? Literally all of this stuff is in ancient tradition. When you start to go back through the history of this, you see the mythology of this. We get a few on prayers and blessings, like how to pray, not to lay down a stone for worship, etc. We get some for love and brotherhood. Some of these are great. Don't take revenge. Don't bear a grudge. The other thing that I wanted to point out as we go through a lot of these laws are how hypocritical they are, because we have God absolutely taking revenge. God's biggest form of justice is revenge. In fact, he tells us not to take revenge so that he can take revenge. So he believes in revenge. He just wants it for himself. Like, there are so many inconsistencies. We have lots of rules for the poor and unfortunate. We have a handful for the treatment of Gentiles. We have a large list for marriage, divorce, and family as a section. Not to curse your father or your mother when you can and when you can't get divorced, which Jesus himself would later say, what God put together, let no man take apart, about the subject. So Moses says you can get divorced, especially under these conditions, but not under these. And Jesus says, no, you can't. So that's interesting. It's also like, I'm just going to go off on a quick side tangent here. The treatment of homosexuals, because of, by the way, some of the laws, that's next, forbidden sexual relations, which mainly focuses on homosexual relations, is to a large extent the reason that we have rules still in today's system that are thankfully being broken every year now on not allowing gay marriage. And yet we have no one fighting for a rule that you can't get divorced. Can you imagine if Christians took up Jesus's command in the New Testament and they said, we're going to march on the Capitol. We are going to fight for what we know to be right. No more divorce. So when you tell me that these old laws don't matter, I'm telling you that a large portion of the Christian community absolutely still wants to hold to the ones that either discuss them or that they think they can get away with, or the ones that don't affect their life, but they want to reserve the right to divorce for themselves. Because why? Because Christians divorce at the exact same rate that secular people do, despite Jesus's specific command. Tell me it's not just a false man-made religion that no one really cares about at the end of the day. People are going to do whatever they want. They're using the Bible as justification. How gross. Then we get sections on time and seasons. So when to work, when not to work. A lot of this has stuff to do with the Sabbath and rules on the Passover. The next section is mainly another huge list of dietary laws. So don't eat winged insects or things that swarm in the water or things that creep upon the earth. Then we have some great stuff on business practices, when to lend, when to charge interest, not to borrow on interest, not to take pledges from a widow, one that every guy is probably committed, which is not to commit fraud in measuring. Then we get into the really important rules here, how to treat your servants and slaves. I've seen it even more since I did my video on slavery, the comments, the emails, the Instagram messages about how wrong I am and how it's definitely just servants and that this is a good thing for them. It's all over my YouTube feed now. And it's just like, just even look at some of these laws. Law number 191 in Leviticus 25:42. Do not sell a Hebrew servant as a slave, because there's a difference between the Hebrew servant and the slaves. Like we have different laws for both of them. Why are we only talking about servants or the indentured servitude? There are slaves. There are real chattel slaves. I mean, it says right here, don't compel the Hebrew servant to do the work of a slave. It's beneath them. Don't treat your Hebrew servant too rigorously. We don't have that for the slaves. All right, next, and I'll speed up here. We have how to swear, how to take an oath, how to make a vow. Then we have all the sabbatical and jubilee year rules. We have a lot of rules on the court and the judicial procedure, like not cursing at a judge, things like that. We get 4 quick verses on injuries and damages, a lot of verses on property and property rights. And again, as I peruse these, a lot of these are very good. Return lost property. Those are great. That also included slaves though. Then we get criminal laws, not to kill an innocent person. Great. Don't kidnap people. Wait a second. Don't kidnap any person of Israel. Got it. Because then there are rules about how you should kidnap your neighbors. Rule 284 from Numbers 15:39 is a tough one. Don't indulge in evil thoughts. It seems like the creator of our brain doesn't even understand that we really are not in control of our thoughts. And it's also conflicting because in the New Testament, he will say that we are in charge of taking our thoughts captive and that being tempted is not a sin, just yielding to temptation is. But through other parts of both the Old and New Testament, thought crime is real, which is insane. Lots on punishment and restitution because our God is a God of vengeance. A couple on prophecy, lots on idols, idolatry, idolatrous practices. One that keeps coming up in a lot of debates today is 366, that a woman should not wear men's clothing. That's Deuteronomy 22:5. So again, really love pulling out those verses when it's convenient. But that same person who is yelling that on their platform has no problem going home and eating their bacon. Some Levitical laws, quite a few of those. Laws on tithing and taxes. Laws on the temple and sacred objects. How to perform sacrifices and offerings. That is a ton of them. Then we get ritual purity and impurity. A couple rules for the lepers. Rules about the king for the Nazarites. And a lot of rules on how to engage in war. For instance, that the evil done to us by Amalek shall not be forgotten. Destroy the seed of Amalek. Yikes. Now we're talking genocide. To exterminate the 7 Canaanite nations from the land of Israel. Oof. Not to keep alive any individual of the 7 Canaanite nations. There goes more baby murder. So anyways, I digress. I'll leave a lot of links down below so you can see that. And there's also a lot of not rules, commandments, or laws, but things you should do in the New Testament. And this is oftentimes an argument. There's over 1,000 things that the New Testament mentions you should do. And these are supposed to be in some Christians' mind, the reformed ideas of these old laws and how we should be executing them in our life. And again, some of those are great. The New Testament has some really pretty things to say, but it also has some really ridiculous and harmful things. Some of them are great, like Romans 12:10 and Ephesians 4:32 say, be kind of brotherly love to one another. Here's another great one. Avoid foolish questions, Titus 3:9. It also says to avoid genealogies in Titus 3:9 and to avoid arguments about the law. Those aren't taken too seriously, are they? But essentially what they did for these kinds of lists is they've just taken anything that has like a verb before it. So abstain from, avoid, ask this, be this. And a lot of the B ones are ridiculous. Be exceedingly glad, be perfect. A lot of the Christian commands in the New Testament are not inherently bad, but the way that they get utilized is bad. Like for instance, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 7:9, let them who cannot restrain marry. Or in other words, if you burn with lust, you should get married. This is what has led a lot of younger people to get married because they want to abstain from sex, which there's nothing wrong with, but rushing into a marriage that Jesus says you can't leave is also not very beneficial. It's just ridiculous advice. We have no idea if they're right for each other, no idea if they're compatible, no idea if they know each other enough. But because the Bible says that if you're burning with lust, you should get married, that's the advice we're going to give. That's not practical. It's also just not wise. But practical and wise go out the window when you're just trying to please God. It's better to be in God's favor than anywhere else. Wrong. It's better to be in a rational position, making educated decisions with as much information as possible. So again, it's not even that everything is innately harmful, it's that it's not leaving room for some practicality and rationality. Okay, I know we spent a lot of time looking at all the commandments and all of the laws and all the rules there, but I think it was important to kind of just showcase what was so important to God. If you think about a parent in their household and the rules that they have, you can kind of tell what the parent is is all about. If my rules are make sure you look both ways before you cross the street, I'm probably concerned about your safety because I love you. If my rules are how dare you bring this in front of me, don't you know that the very sight of that is offensive? Now I'm going to kill the next 3 generations of you, torture you in the basement eternally. Maybe there's something to consider there. Just saying. So let's move on. To take somewhat of a fair stance, I want to point out what Jesus in the New Testament talked about, and then I want to talk about just some keywords. And I feel like this is a really good spot to just say, hey, this is data. And I collected this data from 3 different sources. I mainly used concordances, like physical copies of concordances, specifically Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, as well as Christian sources online, Christian websites that had done word counts and collections of themes, etc. And then also some ChatGPT just to check some of the work. But mainly these are all Christian sources that I'm using. And you can tell different stories with data, but I'm trying to be as fair as I can be here. I think that there's just a reality to what this is. And this is 800,000 words by a God that's supposed to be perfect that just isn't representing that. I'm not even getting into how many of those words are untrue, which is hugely problematic. Like everything out of the mouth of this creator should be perfect about his creation. And he gets the littlest things wrong, like pi, or that bats are not mammals, or the order that the world would have had to be created in, etc. Like the astounding amount of information that is just factually untrue. Genealogies that don't add up, locations, certain governors or rulers that existed at certain times. How many people could have even been alive a few generations after the flood? Like it's absolutely unbelievable how much information is incorrect. And I think that that will warrant its own video. But again, we're just looking at if all of this is true and if all of this is God's intent, taking him at his word for this, what is it telling us about God's nature? So if you've ever been to church about the time of the year when they want to talk about finances, when they want you to give more money to them, they often say something like, hey, even Jesus knew the importance of money. He didn't talk about anything more than money. That's just not exactly true. Depending on how you look at the data, Jesus talked about money anywhere between 15 and 25% of what he said. Again, it kind of determines like, well, in this parable, was it about money or was it actually about salvation, etc.? But 15 to 25%, which is still a huge chunk and very interesting that Jesus would take so much, let's say then 1 out of every 4 or 5 of his words was about money. And yet he didn't take the time to condemn slavery. He only said like 27 words about children in total, none of which, by the way, were don't abuse them. So again, we're seeing a similar theme here, but he focused mainly on 3 things: God / himself, heaven, and hell. Those are his top 3. So we have 376 verses talking about God, and that's going to be God, the Holy Spirit, the Father, speaking about himself, etc., or the Trinity, which the Trinity is not really mentioned. It's alluded to in different ways. Then he talks about heaven 273 times, which is great. He's talking about paradise and streets of gold. But why is he talking about heaven? Because it's in contrast to the 172 times that he's talking about hell. And hell is not so nice. One of the nice verses about heaven is, I've prepared a place for you. That's so nice. And Christians really, really like that idea. Like God is up there. He's thinking about me. He's picked out my mansion. He's putting jewels in my crown. All things Jesus promises to be doing, like almost on a personal level. And this is where we get some of this Jesus is your best friend, help you find the car keys kind of an idea. But there's another place that Jesus prepared for you. And this is something I think if you're going to believe what the Bible says, you need to wrap your head around this, because Christians just seem to see this as something that got away from God. We had a rebel angel and he created hell. Like, no, God created Lucifer knowing exactly what he would do. And even if Lucifer created hell, it was under God's control. We see this in Job when the accuser, which is actually, we don't really get a Satan or a Lucifer until much later in the New Testament. Then all of a sudden there's demons and devils everywhere. But either way, this entity has to ask for permission before he can torture Job. So this is God's design. God also allows there to be a fact that you can go to this place, right? Like if you don't meet his requirements, his judgment is to send you there and to keep you alive. I had a commenter the other day that just kept trying to say, God created a safe space. If you don't want to be around God, you go to the safe space. It just so happens that in the absence of God's presence, it's horrific. What a ridiculous excuse. It's like the grossest thing I've ever heard, but I digress. Satan is part of God's plan. Hell is part of God's plan. That is also a place that was prepared for you. And it's been prepared for the vast majority of everyone who has ever lived. It's that simple. God made you. God chose to make you. God knew if you would believe or not believe. He still chose to make you and still let you be damned eternally. That's it. Essentially, God made most people just so he could torture them. That's the God you worship and love and adore that you call good Father. It's just bewildering to me. Some of the words here Jesus uses to talk about hell tell are words like perish and cut down, slay them in my presence, throw them out, throw them away, throw into the fire, throw into the furnace, throw into prison, the outer darkness, burned, fire, eternal fire, unquenchable fire, worms, loss, tortures, eternal punishment, ashamed. I wonder what religion would be like without a carrot and a stick. And if you think that Christianity or Protestantism is anything other than a carrot and a stick to get you to do and think the right thing, you are woefully misinformed. Read your Bible. So the last thing that I wanted to do is just kind of, it's just interesting. Again, this is the one that has the highest propensity to being misused, because you can take a word, let's just use money, and it can be give your money to the widows. That's a great thing, positive connotation. And you can have another one that says don't give money to a slave, negative connotation, right? So the word money is not in and of itself bad. You need to look at the rest around it. But I think there are some things you can just look at word count and get a sense for what is important to God here. And the number one word that is not a preposition used in the Bible is the word Lord, which is 7,365. And then God is 4,293. So combined, we're almost at 12,000 words there about God himself. And that doesn't include all of the other things, Christ and Jesus and Father, Shepherd. We get a pretty decent proportion of the Bible being just about God talking about himself. I saw this in my notes. I wanted to call this out. When I said how many times children, babies, or kids were brought up, that was looking at the connotation of what we think about, not the children of Israel, which is actually referring to a people group. So that's just another thing where, I could have gotten it wrong, but I tried to be really careful with understanding how the Bible references different things, like how I didn't count men against us because men was meant to talk about all mankind, etc. Just like becoming a child of Christ does not mean being a kid. Being born again is not talking about being a baby. This was a lot of work. I tried to parcel it down best that I can. One thing I thought was really interesting was, okay, who are the non-supernatural beings mentioned most in the Bible? And best I can tell, first of all, you get Israel as an entire concept, 2,500 mentions, which I think it's important to remember, like God has a chosen people, and Israel is the nation that he talks about the most because he had a chosen people. The fact that a God who created everyone and supposedly prepared a place and wants everyone to know and love him, and then decided to have a chosen people that he only revealed himself to for a very long, significant portion of human history, like that's problematic in and of itself. And then we get people. So the number one name is David at 881. And then Moses at 804. And then it goes way down after that, and we get into Abraham and Judah and a lot of these others. And Judah is also kind of a place sometimes, and Israel was also a name. So again, you've got to be careful with a lot of this. But I think it's interesting when we look at the patriarchs, and this is something that I want to do my own video on, so I'm not going to take too much time here, but maybe this is an introduction to mention David more than anyone else. And, David is known in the Bible as a man after God's own heart. And then Moses, who sets God's people free. And then you have Abraham, who was a friend of God. And we have these important patriarchs, and you look at them, and the Christian narrative is actually a really good spin. Like, good job, Christian PR. Like, God can take evil, wicked, broken people and still do amazing things with them. Look how good God is. Look how bad we are. This is the Christian narrative. But the secular narrative is that these are just people, and these people are not particularly good or holy. In fact, you would almost go as far as to say the opposite. I mean, Abraham was willing to kill his own son to receive a blessing from God. Eek. Even in today's Christian fundamentalism, you would be hard pressed to find very many people that would actually be willing to kill their kids. There's been a few, unfortunately, but still, we've kind of progressed past that. We get into Moses. Moses was a murderer, and then we have David, sweet, humble little heart playing, giant slaying David. David's great, isn't he? Well, no, David was a mass murderer. He went out of his way to kill and torture people. These are our biblical heroes. This is the God that we worship. If you read these stories in the Quran with different names, you would be disgusted. But it's in our Bible, and all of a sudden, these are the people we aspire to be like. Okay, I went on that further than I planned to. I think the main point that I was trying to make with this video, and you've gotten it, is just what God chooses to talk about, and then the gap of what God doesn't talk about. He's talking about evil here 657 times. He's talking about fire 617. He's talking about the law, specifically just that word, 599 times. All these words beat out all the pretty words 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 10 to 1. Blood is mentioned 415 times. Wicked 413. Flesh 405. Dead 399. But patience is mentioned 43 times as an example, which is the exact same amount of times that the word uncircumcised is used. So we can talk about all of these horrible things, but when we get down to patience and how great it is, we'll talk about it as much as we talk about dicks. Like, I think that without trying to abuse this data, there is a story being told here. God has some pretty things in this Bible. God has some good rules. He has a lot of bad rules and a lot of ugly things. And you know what that looks like to me? It looks like man. It looks like every other religion. It looks like every other ideology or philosophy. There's harm in it. There's good in it. People abuse it. People use it for good. There's nothing unique or special about the Christian Bible. It has the same issues as every single other holy book, sometimes more. It has nothing unique to say about the world at that time that we couldn't have already known. Most of its stories and archetypes and individuals are 100% copies of religions that came before it. This Bible is not inspired. It is not infallible. It is not holy. It was not written by God. And it is at best an interesting piece of history. It is not even morally useful in this day and age. So that's it for today. I hope that you found this interesting. I expected to go a lot deeper, but this was just taking a long time. I have other points written down and word comparisons and things of that nature, but hopefully this is food for thought. Hopefully you learned something. Let me know in the comments down below what you think. Let me know what I got wrong. Again, please hear my caveat that this is a hard thing to compile and that context matters, that tone matters, that the words you put before and after these words matter. And I've done my best to not try to make a mountain out of a molehill where it wasn't there. But there's a lot of mountains that already exist that are pretty plain to see. Thanks for bearing with me today. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you on the next one.